Welcome again to Tyrannus Hall. My name is Winston Bosch, and I'm here with Bill Young, and we are trying to create a grace-filled space where we can discuss the missional mandate of the church. How you doing, Bill?
I'm doing very well. How are you, Winston?
I'm doing great. So the interview that we're going to look at today is an interview that we did some time ago. You were on holidays, I believe, and so I did this interview on my own, but we're going to go through this interview, and then at the end, we'll have some time, a chance for you and I to discuss it together. Sound like a plan?
Perfect.
All right. Without further ado, let's talk to Joanna Van Dyke and Chris Van Popta about Connect Care Ottawa and the mission to the most vulnerable of our society. Joe, Chris, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited that we get to have this conversation together.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having us.
So you guys are here because you work with Connect Care Ottawa. So maybe one of you can start us off by just telling us a little bit about what Connect Care Ottawa is, what Connect Care is, and why it exists. What's your mission? What are you trying to accomplish with it?
So the reality is that like thousands of people in this city alone every year are at risk of not experiencing a safe and nurturing environment in which to grow into whom God made and meant them to be. And that's a tragic thing. And so Connect Care sees the church as a huge untapped resource in our city. And then we also turn and we look at professional welfare organizations for children, and we see them very under-resourced. And so Connect Care's vision is to see the church activated, to see become adequate care partners with professional organizations in our city to alleviate this need. And then subsequent to that, the church is full of children itself, and children are a heritage from the Lord, and why we should be equipping the church to care well for the least of these within our own midst. Because as a church in a post-Christian world, and hopefully as we invite more people into our church context and into the social networks that we have in our communities, we'll see our own children growing in wholesome, nurturing ways. And who doesn't want that, right?
Yeah, I just want to add that as I've been networking with some of these local child welfare agencies, there's just been a lot of hesitance on their part to work with churches. Mm-hmm. And across the board, there's just this sense that churches aren't a safe place. They're just not safe enough.
Yeah, and then on the other hand too, right, we've got churches who, by and large, generally speaking, are cynical and hesitant to get involved with child welfare organizations. The suspicion goes both ways.
I've often said that our role is essentially to put their hand in the other one's hand for a handshake, sort of connecting the two so that they build some trust and actually take the time to really hear each other's heart and find that they're actually on the same page, because most of the time they are. Yeah,
and it's marvelous. Like you talk to, there's all kinds of people who want to be involved in this kind of work in the church. They see the growing need, but there's just a feeling of like at a loss of where to even start. Like, how do I get into this in the first place? And so with this, we see this as a huge opportunity, and Connect Care is the catalyst in the recipe that will bring these two groups together and help them understand one another really well, and then really activate the heart of the church who really wants to get involved, but just is hesitant and doesn't know how. We're here to eliminate the barriers and train people and give them opportunity to exercise the gifts that God has given them.
So I'd love to chat, well, we will chat just a little bit about how the church can be more involved in that, and then Connect Care's role as that bridge maker, putting people's hands together in order to make things happen. Flesh out for us a little bit what you mean by all of these people that are at risk of not growing up in a family or not being able to, flourish as the human beings that God has made them. Maybe you can speak from your own experiences or your own involvement in Connect Care or in the broader community in Ottawa. What are kind of the things that you see, the needs in general society that you're trying to address?
Well, I've been a foster mom for 10 years now. And we have taken in 5 little girls, which means that I've been intimately involved with 5 of these little girls' mothers' lives. And they, to me, are my hands-on interaction with the kinds of children that needed a church when they were growing up. So a lot of these moms were dealing with broken families of their own. And so they didn't have the supports they needed to raise the little ones they had. A lot of them end up pregnant really young. We had one mom who was 14. A lot of substance abuse, which happens when you don't have good coping skills. Mm-hmm. There is the cultural piece where they're removed from their bands or their tribes and suddenly feel a little bit lost. It kind of goes on, but the theme is that if they were wrapped around with the right support, then they likely wouldn't have found themselves in this position at all.
Yeah, so what we're really talking about here is early childhood trauma and the effect that not being connected to a social network or a sense of identity and community really has on a family, not just, and this gets passed down generationally. And I think what the church's role is to try and do is incorporate these people, especially children and their mothers and fathers, into a network in which they feel secure. And I think that would really help them continue growing in a way that they were made and meant to be, because of the blessings of the church, and frankly of a community that's able to help them. And I saw this for real in a panel discussion that we had going through our foster care training, because my wife Charlene and I are foster parents, and our children are foster brothers and sisters to a little girl right now. And when we were on we were watching a panel discussion with a whole group of kinds of people involved in the whole spectrum of foster care. And yeah, it wasn't easy. We watched this woman who was actually a woman whose children were apprehended from her during a day in which she was in a very low moment. And what had happened was, years prior, she was part of a group of people in college and post-secondary education that weren't living a wholesome life. She had gotten out of that. She had done her education. She'd gone on to become a very successful businesswoman. She got married. She had several children. And her husband ended up leaving her, but she was still able to care for her children in a meaningful way and in a wholesome way. And then one day during her story, she was invited to a party, and she went to that party. And because of a thirst for a network of friends she hadn't seen in a while, she participated in ways that she probably shouldn't have and regretted, and got involved in substance abuse. And it was a small, quiet problem, one that she thought was under control. And then over time, it got a little bit more out of control, and it was harder to hide, but her kids still didn't know about it. Until one day it was all real, and there were police at her door because one of her children had had an accident in the backyard, and she was passed out in her bedroom, unable to help. And because they came at that moment, it was very obvious that she was unable at that point to care for her children. And what was going on here wasn't that she was being a malicious mother. She loved her kids. She wanted the world for them, but she got caught in a trap, and there was no one in her social network to notice. Now, you can imagine if you're part of a church, and stereotypically, let's just talk about our Reformed churches, which I think I'm really thankful for the social network and the amazing community that we have in my local church. I can't imagine my family not being noticed. Let's say our kids didn't show up for catechism, and then they didn't show up for their Christian day school, and then we didn't show up for small groups, and then we didn't show up for church on Sunday. You'd better believe that at least in my local church, I'd have people calling me wondering where I am and if anything's wrong. And that's the beauty of the network of the church, the hands and feet of Jesus, who just want to reach out and make sure everything's okay because you're missing.
I just wanted to, there was when CAS comes and, I just need to figure out how to word this. There is an activity that a worker does when you are undergoing training to be a foster parent. Mm-hmm. And it involves taking out a big, big white sheet of paper and drawing circles of connection that your family has. And so your family goes in the middle, and then you draw lines and bubbles that connect you to all the other supports you have in your life. Mm-hmm. And ours was so large that she had to tape 8 pieces together until it looked like a massive web. And her comment was, and this was a woman who didn't know the Lord, her comment was, I see this all the time with church people.
Mm-hmm.
You guys have the biggest support networks of anyone. And so they're watching, they're noticing that.
Yeah, they call that the eco map, right? Or
there
something.
We go.
Yeah, eco map. And they also made us do a family tree. And I had the same experience. We showed up with what would look like a family forest. It was it was so big we had to unroll it. And we actually were a bit embarrassed because we didn't actually want to unroll it because we saw that everyone else showed up with like a piece of paper as a family shrub. They were a single child married to a single child and they had no uncles and aunts, and they had nobody. And their eco maps were maybe the people they met at work.
Which just speaks to the fact that you grow up in a relatively well-functioning Christian family, and you go to a church community, and you've got perhaps a broader or a bigger extended family. It's so easy to not realize how blessed you are in the middle of all of that, and how even things like not only good spiritual practices, just good household practices and living practices have been passed down through generations. Things like knowing how to set an alarm clock so you get to work on time, and to plan ahead for your day, and for, all these social blessings that we have. And then I think that contributes to sometimes you have people that sort of look down on those who are not doing so well in life and just sort of think, well, you've got to make better choices, not realizing that we benefit from this huge, big network of people and from all of this social blessing, this covenant blessing that we've experienced throughout all of that.
Yeah, I like what you said there, because like what you're really touching on, if you're looking at someone whose behavior is a bit off and you're like, oh, maybe you should get it together a little bit more. I think that's something we really need to analyze as a church, especially as it relates to mission on this topic of inviting the least of these into our communities and accepting them for who they are. Mm. You probably heard the triptych of behave, believe, belong. And we often codify people at their behavior first. And if their behaviors sort of fit in, then we'll let them stick around long enough to believe the things we believe. And then finally we oh yeah, now we talk the same things and you belong. Mm-hmm. And Jesus flips the cart, turns it 100% around and says, no, you belong first. You belong in this group of people. You're mine and I made you. And you'll begin to believe the truths of the gospel as you find it made and as you find it experienced with the hands and feet of Jesus by the people you're associating with. You're going to believe it's true eventually. And then maybe you'll get your life together and start behaving. I mean, I still don't know how to behave properly. And I'm a Christian who's been a generational Christian for as far back in my family tree as I can see. And I know I don't behave properly, but I know I belong. And part of what we're trying to do, and so part of what Connect Care does is offer church coaching. This church coaching, maybe Joe, you're best suited to chat about this.
Yeah, it essentially troubleshoots with the leaders of the church, the ministries they already have and where the gaps are. And then we can start to fill in the gaps. And that includes everything from maybe being focused on a certain demographic to the neglect of another. The idea is hopefully to have ministries that cover the whole gamut, from little ones all the way up to elderly, every culture, every race, every situation. We know that identity issues are cropping up a lot more. LGTB matters, and everybody is a little unsure how to approach that, and their discomfort level is high. We need to acknowledge Indigenous groups in this country, in this city in particular, a lot of Inuit here. And I just think the church has to grow so informed that they're so comfortable that when someone walks into their church who looks a little different and has some different ideas, they're ready to receive them with warmth and with an educated understanding as to the set of issues that might crop up.
Yeah, and so the church coaching product really equips ministry teams and ministry leaders and elder boards and consistories with a lens through which to look at their community and see where some of the opportunities lie to increase awareness and equip their congregational members with the right tools to invite all kinds of people into the community. And that might mean that they're not ready to sit in your pew yet. That's the last mile a lot of the time in ministry in terms of missions. It's the relationships before that are paramount to be able to get them to sit under the preaching. And so if we, as communities in the Great Commission, recognize that the church's role in the least of these in inviting foster families who require care for their children into the community in a way that makes them feel welcome. And it doesn't have to be under the preaching yet, but at least within families, to open up hearts to really pour their lives into and die unto ourselves for the sake of those who are suffering. They will experience Jesus.
I have a quote here in front of me from Rosaria Butterfield's book, The Gospel Comes with a House Key. I think you're probably both familiar with that. That's a book a lot of people that listen to this podcast will have read and found extremely challenging. She's got a quote in here that I just like to read, and then I'd like your reaction to that. Do you think that she's being accurate, or is she overstating it? It goes like this. She says, "Are Christians victims of this post-Christian world? No. Sadly, Christians are co-conspirators. We embrace modernism's perks when they serve our own lusts and selfish ambitions. We despise modernism when it crosses the lines of our precious moralism." And then this quote here: "Our cold and hard hearts, our failure to love the stranger, our selfishness with our money, our time, and our home, and our privileged back turned against widows, orphans, prisoners, and refugees means we're guilty in the face of God of withholding love and Christian witness." So she's saying when Christians are not are being selfish with our home and our money and our time, then in doing so we turn a privileged back toward prisoners, widows, orphans, refugees, that we're guilty in the face of God of withholding love and Christian witness. Is that overstating it? Would you agree with it?
I agree with it 100%.
Yeah, that's not an overstatement at all.
And it's not, I don't agree with it because I want to be condemning.
No.
It's not that I even have it figured out. But when I hear that quote, I look at my own life and I see all kinds of places there that light that's being shone and that quote is pointed at. And, I think the co-conspirator is a pretty interesting way of phrasing it, because it's not as if we maliciously go out to harm our neighbor. It's not as if that means we're co-conspiring in the sense that we had a phone call with the devil, but we certainly can be placed in the same camp if we're not careful, because those who are not for Jesus are against him.
I was just thinking about the particular horror of Jesus on the cross as he was separated from his Father. So withdrawal is violent in its own way. And our withdrawal from the orphan and the widow and the vulnerable is a violence. And so no, it's not an overstatement. If anything, we need to start to speak more candidly and more firmly about the sin that is a part of that kind of withdrawal and withholding.
And I think the biggest risk, one that we face relevantly here in our upper middle class North American society, or middle class North American society, is consumerism. Would be the greatest temptation of the church being the people sitting in the pews, the trappings of the world that distract us. We're taught to go to school, work hard, save money, buy a house, continue to make sure that our children are safe and well fed and have all the toys and have all the things and go off to our whole ecosystem of thought is focused on that. And those are not bad things, but they become sinister when they are to the exclusion of offering our homes and all of those gifts to those who need them more than we do.
And it speaks to the fact that it's also just plainly about being obedient to the call of Christ. When she says, we don't like it when modernism touches our precious moralism. We don't like when the world makes us feel stained, to use the word of James, keeping yourself unstained from the world. We don't want the world to touch our moralism, but I so easily forget that the religion that's pure and undefiled also includes caring for the orphan and for the widow. I love there's a common expression, something along the lines of, don't build walls, but, or something about extending your table, or don't build walls, build a longer table. The idea of fitting more people into your home and into your life. And I know in my own life, sometimes I just want to close the door and put up walls and be in my little sanctuary and run away from other people's pain and suffering. But the call to move towards suffering and to extend the table seems to be a lot of what we're talking about. And I was going to ask you, Joe, because I don't know, probably now about 2 years ago, I ate dinner at your guys' place, and we had that in the little screened off porch that you have, and you just had a table that was a bunch of pieces of plywood on some sawhorses.
Yeah.
But for me, that's kind of a nice image, because it's like, you throw another sawhorse down and extend your table. Mm-hmm. So how do you as a person, as a family, how do you make practical steps to doing that, to extending your table, to making more room in your life, especially for the people that not only don't know Jesus, but are living particularly vulnerable lives?
Become a foster parent.
I think a lot has to do with fear.
Yeah.
Oh, and working to overcome that.
Mm-hmm. Our call initially to be foster parents came with a distinct sense of having an abundance and feeling like I needed to spend it. We needed to spend it on the Lord. And so I think that's where it starts, is we need to call our brothers and sisters to scan their lives and look for that abundance, and they're going to find it. They will find it really quickly, because even the poorest among us, frankly, have an abundant wealth of offerings from the Lord. And then to encourage them strongly to spend it. And spending doesn't have to be foster care. Connect Care is not just about foster care. It's about spending on the vulnerable. And there are a plethora of ways to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of my first interactions with Connect Care was a couple of years ago. Connect Care had a conference, they called it the All-In Conference. And at that time, the call was real to the church to be involved in spending on the vulnerable, but everybody has a something.
Yeah.
And so that was actually really encouraging, because my wife Charlene and I were considering foster care for several years, probably the better part of a decade, but we just really didn't know what it all meant. So we thought we'd go to this conference. But when we were there and we heard that, really the church's role isn't to each of you belongs a child in your home. Well, no, really, you live as a family, as a household of faith. And in that household of faith, you may have some people who are really well equipped and have the resources and the space and all the parameters, and they've gone through all the education to host a child and to bless a family who needs care for their child while they're healing themselves. And then someone can bring you meals, and someone can pray for you, and someone can do some driving and backfill some of the things that are going on in your life that need to get done because you're right. So as a household of faith, that's really the call of the church, is to be an absolutely delightful community that helps one another, helping the neighborhoods in which you live.
Which sounds a lot like what you're saying is, I think of so many Canadian Reformed congregations that do a really good job of helping each other. If someone's sick, someone's got a need, they're making meals, keeping care of kids, but you're saying, well, let's take all those strengths and just turn them a couple degrees and point them toward the most vulnerable people that may not be yet members of your church, people in the broader community. Is that a fair way to say it?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a both and, right? Like you're working together as a family, and you're working as a family in a community.
The most powerful thing that offered us direction as a family was to begin to pray really just one prayer. And that was, God, where do you want us to spend our lives? Who do you want us to spend on? And he answers that. I don't need to get more practical than that. Honestly, he's going to answer, and he's going to make it clear. And so I would challenge the church leadership to pray as a group. Where do you want us to spend ourselves? And God will answer.
Yeah, and God answers that in the hearts of those praying, but also he'll send his spirit to make it live in your church. It's a promise. He'll listen. It's his promise. And so that's why there's so much hope. And I think part of where Charlene and I, too, in our own context, getting into this, there was a lot of fear, a lot of unknowns, and frankly, there still are. And I can't promise you that will ever go away, but there's immense hope, because the only thing you have to do when you're confronted with uncertainty is not ask for a vision. If God gave you a vision, he wouldn't have given you faith. Why did he give you faith? So that you don't need a vision. He gave you faith. He gave you faith in what? It's not a magical pixie dust. He gave you faith in promises that he gave us, right? And it's those promises we can depend on. And if we're going to say we're Christian, then we better start depending on those promises. And so as a church community, we can pray, pleading on the promises of Christ that he'll make these things real in us, that we'll be transformed into his likeness, and it will come true. It comes true.
That's a beautiful way to put it, Chris, because oftentimes when you talk to somebody about or the subject of foster care or adoption or just of, perhaps having someone come live in their basement, in your basement, or, spending yourself in a way that you're not used to for someone that's particularly vulnerable, people say things like, well, I'm not sure if I could do that, under the impression that that's for somebody else, perhaps, or, I'm afraid of that. But certainly this idea of like, well, you sort of need some sort of special calling for that. But it seems that, as you both are shaking your heads, no, go ahead, Joe. What is coming to your mind when people say that?
Well, it used to upset me a lot when someone said that, as if I were a robot, and that you're called to be a foster parent if you're an unemotional robot, and that somehow, anyway. So I often respond, I actually hurt just as badly as anyone ever would, but I do it anyway. I do it in spite of the hurt because these little ones are worth it, right? And so the response is to call people into a life of hurt. I said, we signed up to hurt. We signed up for the pain. And the truth is, our work is to cling to Christ so deeply that there's nothing we wouldn't spend on him. And that makes it a big yes to taking in anything you love deeply and then have to let go. I prayed over my little ones' cribs when they were babies, and I said, they're yours, so that I could prepare my heart to hold them loosely, which is a really difficult thing to do. But it's something that we have to do daily.
And I think somewhere in that pain, we learn something about ourselves that Jesus is asking us to become. And I'll speak a bit personally here. When we had our first placement, we had a boy placed in our home at 6 days old, and he left us a couple months later, and we couldn't imagine or prepare for what that felt like. And it's a lot of that kind of fear that I think we were struggling with when we first entered into this calling. And when we were confronted with it, we saw what it did to us, and we praised God for it. When you hear your children say out loud, why does it love to hurt? Why does it hurt to love someone so much? As they yell into their pillow because the child that you were caring for had to leave. Why does it hurt to love somebody so much? These are things that make you realize who Jesus is in ways that you just didn't have words or thoughts or feelings or emotions for, never had the opportunity to realize before, because we were living a life where we were concerned about trying to stay safe, stay comfortable, right? But that's not the good life. That's not the life Jesus calls us into. And he doesn't call us into that life because he knows it's not good for us. And then when you experience this kind of, you have to break something to grow. You have to have something, you need some sort of, it's a paradoxical truth I'll have to spend my life learning. But when you learn it and you start to experience it, you realize you just have a deeper relationship. I personally have a deeper relationship with my children as a result, and with our Savior Jesus as a result. It's a mystery, and it's beautiful, and it belongs to the world, and we have no right hoarding it for ourselves.
Yeah. That's thanks so much for sharing that, both of you, because isn't this just the amazing way that God works in his topsy-turvy, upside-down kingdom? Like, he calls you to go out into the street and die. He calls you to deny yourself and to take up your cross. He calls you to help and seek and love the most vulnerable. And then in this awesome way, when you do it, you discover that actually he's been working on your own heart, and he's been using it to bless you and to change you and to realize how vulnerable you are and how much you need his love. And that it's really not about being a hero in any sense of the word, but it's about the Lord working in your own life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's beautiful. I'm thinking now, people watching this podcast, maybe do it like this, pastors like me, if you've got a pastor, or somebody that's in a position of leadership who's got people's ear, what do you wish, more pastors were doing? What do you wish, that we could be doing more of?
Yeah, it's a great question. Primarily, pastors aren't on pulpits for themselves. They're there to show Jesus, a picture of Jesus, preach Jesus grace. One of the things I read in a book several months back, probably half a year ago, and it's a simple sentence that stuck with me in a way that is shaping me daily. And it's a sentence that says, you cannot give what you don't receive. And so when we're trying to exercise the gifts God's given us, we're only doing that because he's gifted us with something in the first place, right? And so if we want the church to pour out the gifts of Christ into the world, then it has to come through faithful, biblical, Jesus, Christ-centered preaching that pours into their lives so that it pours into the community. Pastors, I believe, bless their congregations and bless the world when they preach the grace of Jesus.
Personally, I was longing as a younger woman thinking about foster care. I was longing for more of a call to action, more of a call to do something with your faith. Mm-hmm. And so I would say, pastors, just look your congregation in the eye and say, this faith you have, what are you going to do with it? And then start to prayerfully ask God how he wants that congregation to start to step out in serving the vulnerable. And it will look very different depending on the church, the location. There's all sorts of factors at play. But if the congregation as a whole is eager and submitting to God and ready to serve, he's going to answer that in really incredible ways. So,
yeah, and find things to celebrate, because even in a typical, like a stereotypical congregation who's just a beautiful place to be in, there is real preaching, but these kinds of initiatives aren't being acted upon or whatever. There are still things to celebrate. And I think celebrating people and what God's doing in their lives propels them forward. The spirit of encouragement blowing into their lives will fill their sails with inspiration, and they'll move forward with the spirit behind them, because your pastors and elders and ministry leaders are encouraging their congregation in the small things even. Condemnation never works. Never. So there can be no room for guilt in this conversation. I mean, there has to be conviction based on the scriptural preaching. This is what it puts before you today. Are you going to listen? Because here's consequences if we don't. That's different, right? Yeah. That's encouragement still. That's a different kind of encouragement. I think both are necessary, because faith without works is dead. We know that that's a scriptural message. Is your faith real if it's not being acted upon? Well, I don't want to get caught in the trap that this is the only way to activate your faith. I mean, of course, many Christian households are using the faith apportioned to them in different kinds of ways other than foster care. But it's very clear, if you read the Bible front to back, there's hundreds of verses about the widow and the orphan and the role of the church. Hundreds. It's all over Scripture. And so it ought to be part of the church's role. I think the church largely forgot, and they need to be reminded. Back before the Great Depression, we had churches building hospitals and schools and being part of social care and foster care and orphan homes and all kinds of things in society was primarily the role of the church. And the community around us in the West understood that. And that was normal. But after the Great Depression, during the Great Depression, everyone lost their resources to an economic collapse and a great dust bowl. And then the government started taking control and had to, by and large, take control of these things and started institutionalizing these things in ways that were still Christian by and large. I mean, most people back, in those days were still Christians, but as it drew into a post-Christian world where we are today, those institutions have lost touch and actually now mistrust one another. And I think
I think about even just in family histories of numerous people in my church go back to the Netherlands, and people have stories about families taking in Jews during World War II, making their table bigger to take in children of another religion, children of a different culture, children who are particularly vulnerable under crisis. That was a normal and encouraged thing to do. And we have to regain a little bit of that, I think. But at the same time, I'm really hopeful. I'm hopeful also for Canadian Reformed churches where there is a pretty big emphasis on family. People still tend to have larger than average families. There's an emphasis on raising your kids up as covenant children. I think that there's a lot of resources and a lot of ability and a lot of blessing that if we can tweak that and invite a whole other group of the population into that there's way for blessing to flow in multiple directions that would just be wonderful. So thanks to your comments to thinking about pastors. Now for just the average person that's sitting in the pew on Sundays, a member of a church, and they're listening to you guys thinking, yeah, like, okay, so what now? Like, what does this mean for me? What can I do? What would be a next step when they finish off this and they're tempted just to go and watch another YouTube video? What would you encourage them to do?
I was them. I was that person.
Yeah.
And I don't have a happy ending in the sense that I had to go outside of my church to get the help we needed to learn more about foster care. So maybe learn from that. I was the person who was looking around and there was no adoption story anywhere. There was no foster care story. There was a lot of amazing people doing wonderful things, but that particular thing wasn't represented. And so we essentially, our learning was outsourced to people outside the church. So if you are that person, do what you need to do. The first thing to do is to grapple with your pastor about it. Ask him if he can support you and start to mobilize the whole church to start thinking more about it. And then together, everyone can take that journey. But if not, I would encourage them to access other resources. I ended up speaking to friends who are part of another church. Look for models, look for families that are doing what you're longing to do and learn from them and gain the encouragement from them. And then bring it back to your church. Be the one to maybe start the change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll never forget, we were at the All In conference a couple years back, and Hank DeYoung was there, a good friend, acquaintance from our network of churches, and he just said to me, just baby steps. It's just a baby step to learn something new. So you don't have to make a decision today. Just make a decision to learn something you didn't know before. So pick up a book, go to a conference, make a step toward it, go take your foster care education. It's free. It's a commitment, but it's free. If you just want to know more to make a better decision, don't stand here in action, but willful ignorance. Education is action. It might not be doing something yet, but it's action, and it's good action. So just take the step to picking up a book about foster care and exploring that and pray about it. That's what I would say to anyone sitting in a pew, sitting in a church, part of a church community, part of a small group. Maybe go through foster care book with a small group that you're part of. Commit to learning what that means so that you can support other people who are fostering. It doesn't mean it has to be you, but that I think would be an important step in the life of a Christian, is just to make the decision to learn more. There's a great book called Reframing Foster Care by Jason Johnson. Highly recommend it. If you want to leave this podcast today with a takeaway, that's a great book to get started.
And also just bringing Rosaria back into the conversation. Yeah. You actually don't have to go much further than your neighbor. Yeah. And I would say a lot of us likely avoid certain neighbors because they're uncomfortable to be around. Or perhaps you're in an affluent neighborhood and you don't even have neighbors that are particularly difficult. They're all kind of pleasant. Go looking for difficult people. I recommend going to look for difficult. You'll find them pretty quickly.
A certain kind of Enneagram would do that.
Yeah. And then practice loving. Just practice loving in a really hands-on way, like eating at a patched together picnic table at the back of your house, but nothing fancy.
Yeah, it's not complicated.
No.
Yeah, I love, that Jason Johnson uses that illustration of running to a telephone pole. Like you're out jogging and you run to a telephone pole and then you walk to the next one, you run to the next one. He's like, just run to one telephone pole. Like, don't make the decision that, we're going to try to start immediately a new Connect Care in our city, or I'm going to foster or adopt tomorrow, but run to the next telephone pole. It's that baby steps idea. Read a book, talk to a neighbor. Yes, seek in a concrete way to make the next step of obedience, make the next step of saying, yeah, I'll move toward in some way the suffering, the vulnerable, trusting Christ's promises that he's going to bless it along the way. I really, really appreciate that. And then I'd add in that, go check out the Connect Care Ottawa website and see what they're doing and see what kind of information and links are on there, because there's all kinds of interesting stuff that's happening there. Maybe we could end it like this, Chris and Joe. Tell me something that in your work with Connect Care or your life as foster parents, something that just makes you want to praise the Lord, something that puts a smile on your face and that you're just so thankful to the Lord for. Maybe you've touched on it already, but is there one thing in particular that comes to mind that you say, this is something that I just praise God for, that he's doing, in the middle of all of this? Yeah,
I'll try and keep my emotions in check, but we really made it a mission to befriend the mothers of these little ones. It was our intentional practice to. I remember the day after getting our first daughter, we wanted to invite the mom to dinner, and the worker had to say, "No, that's not how it works. That's not how it works. You don't get to do that."
You're breaking the rules already.
Breaking the rules already. But we ended up we ended up having an absolutely beautiful relationship with 3 of the 5 mothers. And one of them came to Christ, and we sang at her funeral when she died a few years later. So, yeah, praising God for the way that tangibly loving these hurting moms who you would think would have every reason to not want to befriend me. I'm the one raising their child that they lost, and yet they were so hungry for it that they said yes with open arms.
Yeah,
that's beautiful.
Praise the Lord. It's amazing. Yeah, and I think our first placement, this young little boy, full of promise and had a very stunted future ahead of him, and we were in a place of conflict at that time in our own hearts about wanting the kingdom for this little child, but having to, in his particular situation, his mother moved away to another city, and so another fostering and adoption agency CAS agency had to take responsibility for his care in that city. And so he was transferred out of our home. And that caused all kinds of turmoil, because there's this interplay between like wanting to bless this child, but also wanting this child to experience who Jesus is. And I remember, Winston, praying with you as I was driving along talking about this, and your prayer was that just the small time that he would be in our home would have been a blessing that would last him his lifetime. And that ended up, man. So God designed it ahead of time that he would be placed into a Christian home, into the city in which he was placed, and just continued that blessing for him. And to see the joy on that family's face that we got to end up meeting, they reached out to us the next day. They received it, and there's no obligation, right, to do that when you receive a child into your home, to reach out to the previous caregiver's home and make that connection. But they offered us so much peace in that by giving us a call and saying he had landed, and man, did you guys ever do a great job? Like, he's so healthy and well, and by the way, we're Christian and we just want to pray for you and bless you. Like, I mean, these are only things that God designs, and just marvelous to see his design in all things. It's just so much to be thankful for and to give him praise for.
Well, amen to that. That's beautiful. Hey guys, God bless you as parents and as foster parents, and then God bless you and the rest of the people that are working with Connect Care as you try to build this bridge between all of the people that are working hard trying to keep care of vulnerable children and families and the Church of Christ. And I hope that I hope that one of the rewards that we get in heaven is that we'll be able to see how God used our lives in the lives of others, that we'll be able to step back and see the connections and the things that he's done. I think that would just be a marvelous gift from God. And I know for sure that if you keep on the path that you're on with Connect Care, that you'll be able to influence many churches and many generations, and that the Lord will be able to bless that. And I pray you'll be able to see it with your own eyes one day, all the connections that you help the church become more robustly on the side of the widow and the orphan. Thanks so much for chatting with us today. God bless you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Winston. God bless you.
Well, I really enjoyed having that conversation with Chris and Joe, Bill, and I wish that you could have been a part of it, because you and your wife have also been foster parents. And so now that you've had a chance to listen to the interview, I'm wondering if there's anything in particular that we discussed that really resonated with you, or that you saw a link between their experience and your own experience as a foster parent.
Yeah, I think there was a point in the interview where Joe, or maybe it was Chris, it's a little confusing in my mind presently, but they said how they were motivated to move in this direction because of a mentality of generosity. And my wife and I have always been pro-life, but we haven't always approved of certain pro-life tactics, I suppose you might say. And so we were thinking of ways in which we might be positively pro-life. And so fostering got on our radar, in part because my brother had become a foster parent. And so we gave that some serious thought and decided in the end that we believe this would be a wonderful way for us to be positively pro-life, to recognize that there are children in the world who are sometimes unwanted. And then, of course, there are children who are apprehended from their families and don't always have a place to go. And it was a way for us to say, we believe that every child is wanted. And one way for us to demonstrate that was to welcome children into our home.
And oftentimes, in my experience, when people think about those who foster or those who adopt, there is sort of a mentality of oh, aren't you special for doing that? You know, haven't you, look at you, you've done a wonderful thing. Has it been your experience, the experience of you and your wife, that fostering children has not been something just that the Lord has enabled you to help others, but that it has been a blessing to yourself, or that the Lord has used it in your life as a means to bless you, so that it hasn't only been you helping somebody, but those people in helping you? Has that been your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think every foster parent would probably say that he or she learns a lot about himself or herself in the process. And I think, speaking personally, I was exposed to a range of emotions I didn't know existed, from great excitement at times and extraordinary pain at times. But it was very enriching for our family. I prefer to use the language of us being a foster family than my wife and I being foster parents. But we had teenagers in the house at the time. And, you know, when you're a teenager, it's at the point in one's life where one is easily self-obsessed. And it was very heartwarming for us to see our teenage boys change diapers and prepare bottles, and often do so without resistance. And it's not because they are such remarkable teenage boys, but I think their hearts were captivated by the little ones that we had in our home. And so there was often little resistance to helping out when it was necessary. We had twin boys in our home for a while, very high needs little boys. We picked them up from the hospital. So they were very small and very needy. And one of our boys was 16 years old at the time. And he said to my wife on a few occasions, "Why don't you sleep in my bed? And I'll get up and feed the twins in the middle of the night, and you can get your rest." And that was very, very heartwarming for us to see. So by means of these little ones, you could say our whole family, I think, was discipled in the way of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. So we got this federation of churches that has got a really strong pro-life culture in terms of advocating and giving money toward organizations that fight for the life of the unborn. We've got a church culture and tradition where we've traditionally had lots of large families, a big emphasis on covenant children and their place in the church, big families, good family atmosphere for a family culture. Can you just say a couple words? How would you encourage, churches and people with all of that blessing, all of that goodness, all of that, that great stuff to build on? What would you say to that on how we can move that forward in other directions to care for the most?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on that for some years. I think at times we as pastors in particular can be discouraged by the lack of progress that we feel we should be seeing in the church. We want to see greater sanctification, greater maturity in Christ, and we sometimes overlook the fact that for the most part, our churches are populated by rather stable families. And these families are in a great position, therefore, to help out in the community, not least in foster care. I don't know if we always realize how much of a resource it is to have a stable family. And when my wife and I were in foster care with the Children's Aid Society in Hamilton, we heard from the worker who worked with us that the social workers who worked at the Children's Aid Society in Hamilton wanted Dutch Reformed families more than any other. They would fight over who got to be involved with a Dutch Reformed family. And that's, Canadian Reformed, Christian Reformed, United Reformed, Free Reformed, whatever, simply because they were so stable and so easygoing and so low maintenance, you might say. And this is a credit, of course, to the grace of God in Christ, who has instilled in families, in our churches, the stability that I'm talking about, a level of consistency, again, for the most part, healthy, mature relationships. So there is a resource within our congregations that we haven't always tapped, and it's simply in healthy families.
That's super encouraging. And wouldn't it be amazing for all the people that, listen to this video, if we could have a number of them who take that next step, run to that next telephone pole, seek to see what they could do for vulnerable children and families in their communities, so that we could have children's aid societies around the country in Canada saying, yeah, we want families from that church, or we want families from that Christian culture, because those ones will do a good job. That would just be beautiful. Let's leave it at that, Bill. That's a beautiful encouragement. Thank you so much. And we pray, as always, that God would use this discussion to push people forward and encourage people in their Christian walk as they think about mission in this world.
Absolutely. Wonderful to see you again, Winston.